Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast by Bangalore International Centre, bringing you conversations that move, inform, and encourage discourse.
I knew that there were 338,000 British and French soldiers who were evacuated from that port over the course of 9 days. But to read that there had been Indian soldiers there as well was amazing to me. That was just so fascinating. And I read the story, and then I read of how they got back to Britain, to England, to the port of Dover. And they had arrived there in the early hours of the 29th of May 1940, and that they were all safe. And when I read that, I have to admit that I started crying there in the National Archives with people around me doing their research. And there was a tear in my eye because it was just so extraordinary and so great to know that they had all got to Britain safely.
On 28 May 1940, in the early days of the Second World War, Major Akbar Khan marched at the head of 299 soldiers along a beach in northern France. They were the only Indians in the British Expeditionary Force at Dunkirk. What journey had brought these men to Europe? What became of them and their comrades captured by the Germans? In this episode of BIC Talks, author and historian Ghee Bowman talks to writer and journalist Vaibhav Vats about his book, The Indian Contingent, The Forgotten Muslim Soldiers of the Battle of Dunkirk, while examining the larger British narrative and place in history, details his research and tells an important, although obscure and astonishing story of the Indian Contingent, the Muslim soldiers who fought in the pivotal Battle of Dunkirk. From their arrival in France on 26 December 1939 to their return to an India on the verge of partition. Over to Vaibhav.
Just like to say, I loved your book, and it was really sort of valuable and very moving and poignant account of something that even most of us don't know about here in India. So I'd just like to start with asking you if you could share a little bit about your personal background and how did you come to be interested in the Indian experience of World War II?
Thank you so much, Vaibhav. Well, in terms of my background, I've done lots of things in my life. I mean, I'm now aged 60. I've worked in the theatre. I've worked around the world. I worked in Egypt. I worked in Turkey. I've been a teacher. I've worked for NGOs. And there's all kind of lots of different things in my life. So I haven't had a straight line of trajectory of career. I've been kind of jumping around and going, backwards and forwards and sideways. And then about 8 years ago, I was working for a small local development education charity here in my city of Exeter. I live in Exeter, which is in the southwest of England. And we were doing a project on the multicultural history of Exeter. So we were looking at people who had come from the time of the Romans 2,000 years ago onwards, people who'd come to Devon, to Exeter, and settled here, or just come for a short time and moved on. And we found some extraordinary stories that nobody knew. We brought them all together, and it was a great project. And one of the things that we found were some photographs of 3 photographs of Indian soldiers in the southwest of England with mules and with puggarees, with turbans on their heads. And I was amazed because I knew something about the Second World War. I thought I knew quite a lot, but I'd never imagined that there were Indian soldiers here in Britain. And so I looked on the internet first, and I didn't find very much. There was something, but not very much. And then I went to the archives, the National Archives in London, and there I found a war diary. So this was the official diary of the 25th Company of the Royal Indian Army Service Corps. And it told the story day by day in a very kind of dry and military and sort of analytical way. It told the story of how they started in Punjab in November of 1939, how they got together, how they got onto trains and went down to Bombay, got onto ships, sailed across the Indian Ocean, through the Suez Canal, through the Mediterranean, getting colder and colder as the journey went on, and arriving in the south of France on the day after Christmas, 1939. And then it told the story of how they went up to their postings in the north of France, and how, as they travelled, the water was so cold that they had to warm it up before the mules could drink it. And how they got to the north of France, joined the British Army, and then 5 months later, the Germans attacked, and they had to flee very quickly. They had to run away to Dunkirk. Now, I knew about Dunkirk. I think I've known about Dunkirk for most of my life as a battle that was an evacuation that was an incredibly important part of the war. And I knew that there were 338,000 British and French soldiers who were evacuated from that port over the course of 9 days. But to read that there had been Indian soldiers there as well was amazing to me. That was just so fascinating. And I read the story, and then I read of how they got back to Britain, to England, to the port of Dover, and they had arrived there in the early hours of the 29th of May 1940, and that they were all safe. And when I read that, I have to admit that I started crying there in the National Archives with people around me doing their research. And there was a tear in my eye, because it was just so extraordinary and so great to know that they had all got to Britain safely. And so from there, it just became, I started to look around and find other documents and other places and people who remembered them. And it just just took over, really. So when that project ended, then I went back to university as a mature student, and I did a master's degree. And then I did a PhD degree, which was all about them and their stories, and going around to France, to Germany, to Pakistan, and to India for my research. And then I wrote the book. It's been a sort of 8-year journey of discovery, of awakening, and of it's a bit like a detective as well, finding something over here and something over there, and a bit of somebody's memory and a document and a bit reference in a book, and bringing them all together, and then writing them and turning them into something to give to the world. That's the story.
It's an incredible story. And actually, you've already answered the question that I wanted to ask you as a follow-up, is how you went about the research, because it's a book that spans the world, the villages of Punjab to Africa, the various battlefields of Europe. But moving on, I'd like to ask you, for the many listeners who may not have read the book, could you speak a little bit about how the Indian contingent was formed and to what purposes it was deployed in World War II?
Absolutely. So they were all what were then called Punjabi Muslims. So that's part of the British martial race idea, that there are some people in British India who were inherently warlike, who were natural warriors. So the Sikhs, the Punjabi Muslims, the Gurkhas as well from Nepal, and other groups. And so they were almost all from the north of Punjab, from around Rawalpindi, Jhelum, and most of them were professional soldiers who'd been in the army for several years. Some of them had been in the army since the First World War, in fact. Some of them were in their 40s or even, late 40s. They were all part of the Royal Indian Army Service Corps. So that was the part of the Indian Army that was responsible for supplies, so food, ammunition, barbed wire, and transport. So getting these things to the front line, that was the job of the Royal Indian Army Service Corps. And it was a massive corps. By the end of the Second World War, it was enormous. I can't remember how many hundreds of thousands, but a very big part of the army. And they were divided into, when they arrived in France, there were 4 animal transport companies. So each animal transport company was 315 men, and 300 and something mules. And those 180 of those men were mule drivers. So these were guys whose expertise was not in handling a vehicle, not in driving and changing gear, but in handling an animal, or rather two animals, because when they started at the beginning of the war, they were there with a cart. So there was a driver, a cart, and two mules. That was their basic format. And the reason that they were there was because the British Army went into France at the beginning of the Second World War in September 1939. And at that stage, the British Army had no animal transport apart from a very, very small half company. So the motto was not a horse in the force. So they were completely mechanized, completely using trains and trucks and lorries and so on. But they realized straight away, that there would be situations, there would be conditions in which the vehicles wouldn't work. So if it was very snowy or muddy or on a steep slope, or any other condition, perhaps where they wanted to be quiet, where they wanted to deliver things quietly. So they thought, okay, well, we need the old-fashioned method of animal transport. We don't have that in the British Army. Look to the Empire. In the Indian Army, there were 36 companies, animal transport companies, which had been used particularly on the northwest frontier, but also elsewhere. And they said, okay, well, that's the place to go. So they sent a telegram to the India office and then to Delhi, and these four companies came. And as well as the four companies, there were also other units that were supporting them. So the majority of men, as I said, were these mule drivers. There were also guys who were veterinary officers to look after the mules and the horses. There were a few horses. There were medical officers. There were cooks. There were sweepers. There was a Maulvi, an imam attached to every company. And so it was a whole kind of it was designed to be self-contained. It was designed that they could, each company could look after itself. And then the whole of this force, which is called Force K6, the whole of Force K6 could support and look after each other. And when they arrived in France, there were 1,723 men. So it's a small group. It's the size of a couple of battalions. It's not a large force at all.
You thrillingly described the ship journey to Marseille when they land in 1939, the day after Christmas, as you said. And then early on in the book, you write, each company resembled a Punjabi village transplanted onto French territory. I'd like to ask you about the motivations of the soldiers fighting for the Raj at a time when there was massive anti-colonial movements afoot in India. So why were they fighting for the colonial power?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think they were fighting for the colonial power for the same reason that the Indians had been fighting for the colonial power since since the 17th century, certainly since the 18th century, which was that, and for the British Empire since 1857. Before that had been the East India Company, but actually for Britain since 1857. So they were fighting for money. They were fighting because they could get an income. So a lot of these guys were from rural families. They were working, they had small farms in the Punjab countryside. And if they joined up, then that was a way to bring in money for the family. So that would be their regular income, a lot of which was sent home to their families directly. And then, of course, if they served for a long time, or if they got promoted, or if they got a medal, then that would increase their income. And then there was also a tradition. There was a sense of tradition, that this was something that for some of these villages, their fathers had done, their grandfathers had done. So Major Muhammad Akbar Khan, for example, his father had been in the army and his grandfather had fought on the side of the British. And so there was that strong tradition within the village. It was something that was seen as a good thing to do, something where there was an established route, an established process for joining the British Indian Army. And a sense of a kind of sense of honor, a sense of that this is that idea of the kind of the martial races, that idea that this is something that is it's a manly thing to do. Now, of course, the question is, to what extent were these guys political? To what extent were they interested in politics? Were they interested in, the Congress Party and the the independence movement that had been, happening over such a long period of time? And that's hard to know. Of course, within India at the time, there was a spectrum of opinion. So there were the people who were supremely loyal, in inverted commas, to the British Empire, and there was a party within Punjab led by what's his name, Sikandar Khan, which was, taking that stance of, yes, we should support the British, and yes, we should join the army. And then Gandhi and Nehru, and the Congress kind of mainstream, if you like, and Jinnah as well to some extent, although Jinnah was more supportive of the British. But Gandhi and Nehru's stance was more, yes, we're anti-Nazi, yes, we're anti-fascist, but, we're not going to support the empire that's oppressing us, but we're not going to fight against it. And then you got Bose, Subhas Chandra Bose, who is taking the other end, if you like, of the spectrum and saying, this is crazy. Why should we Indians fight for the colonial power or even, take a kind of neutral stance? We should fight against the colonial power. Now, these guys were soldiers, and some of them were educated. The majority of them weren't particularly educated, but some of them clearly were. A couple of them were officers who were from, educated backgrounds. And some of them would have had quite strong political views. And maybe we can talk later about Captain Annis, for example, who was imprisoned and was forced to make a choice about whether to continue to support the Raj, to continue to support the British, or to flip over and go against them.
Right. I'd love to get to that in a bit. What you're saying reminds me of Richard Eaton in his book, India in the Persianate Age, which I read not too long ago. And he speaks about a military labor market that was ever present in India, even before the British arrived. So do you think there's a way that carries forward in the British Raj all the way up to the 1930s, that there is this ever-present military labor market, which just whichever part can pay for their services, they are ready to sort of, work being a strange word, but they're ready to be deployed for that?
Definitely. And people who had, if they didn't have experience themselves, they had it in the family. So they were kind of ready to do that in a similar way that the Gurkhas do now. I mean, the Gurkhas are still part of the British Army, even in 2021. There is still a brigade of Gurkhas, and, men from Nepal are signing up to fight for the British. Well, it's no longer the empire, but to fight on the side of the British. So that idea, yes, of a military labour market, and that they will fight, without it necessarily being a political decision or a decision that's related to, in inverted commas, loyalty, but it's a decision that's related to finances and to family, improving your family, improving the chances for your family.
There's an extraordinary camaraderie between the Indian soldiers and their European hosts, which seems genuinely remarkable from today's vantage point of racism and xenophobic nationalism. What I was intrigued by and was what accounted for this camaraderie. Was it just the collective spirit channeled by war, or was it something deeper?
That's a good question. Firstly, it's worth saying that there had been large amounts of Indian soldiers in Europe in the First World War. So it's sent to France at the beginning of the First World War on the Western Front, very important, plugging the gap there. So for French civilians, particularly in the parts where the British army had been, they were not new. Equally, a lot of them, when they were in the First World War, when they became ill, when they were became casualties, a lot of them were taken to the south of England, where they were in hospitals. So in places like Brighton, they would already have been known. So that's a small part of it. I mean, the camaraderie is a good word, and they were. There are lots of stories that I found in the book, and actually stories that I found since then of really strong relationships, and in one case, a marriage. And children being born, and relationships that lasted long after the war, with correspondence back and forth, and Indian soldiers who were so who felt so comfortable here that they actually migrated back here after the war. So yeah, and I found one clear story of racism and lots of other kind of possibilities, but the balance is definitely towards them being accepted and welcomed and made friends with. And that's, I think a lot of that is about, it's kind of grassroots level. This is not, yes, there's propaganda going on, and yes, people are saying, they've come 7,000 miles to help us, and there's lots of film coverage and so forth. But it's much more about ordinary people at the ordinary level. So, I mean, it's similar. Recently, I was on Dartmoor, which is a rather wild part of England, not far from here. And one time while we were there, we were walking along in this kind of high, windy, wet area, and we came across some Gurkha soldiers. 4 of them who were kind of in a little hollow, and they were having a cup of tea. And I was pretty surprised, and I said to them, "Namaste," and they said "Namaste" and smiled, and we had a little exchange. And then I went on, and I think it must have been a little bit like that for these guys. So there they were on the mountains of Scotland or Wales or in a village, and they were just kind of, I think they were friendly guys. I think that's part of it. They were, there's lots of good photos of them where they're smiling and looking happy and, and kind of being, sending out a genial expression into the world. And imagine, you're in a small village in Britain, a local white British person walking along the high street, and they see these people go past, or they're out on the hills and they see them go past. And then they're there the next week as well. And suddenly they become, they stop being strange, and they become regular. They become part of the background, and they're smiling, and they are offering, they're offering things to eat. They're offering things like sultanas. They had a supply of sultanas, which were not common in Britain at the time. Or they're making chapatis, and they're sharing the chapatis with people, and some of the people like the chapatis and some of them don't. But there's an exchange there. Or they're buying eggs from the farmers. Eggs were greatly in short supply in Britain during the war. And also, another factor is that they're very friendly with children. There's a lot of stories of children who remember them. I mean, that's partly because the adults who remember them were long dead by the time I started to do this project. But there's a lot of stories from children who remember them very favourably. There's a lovely photo in the book of a gymkhana in France, in the north of France, where there's civilians and soldiers watching the dancing, and the children are sitting on the laps of the soldiers, and it just looks perfectly natural. It just looks like this is a kind of, they're just with their friends.
As the German Blitzkrieg kicks into gear, it sends these various companies into pandemonium and vastly different outcomes. Many return to England. In fact, most of them return to England, but many become prisoners of war. Just keep staying with England for now. What I was interested in was, the Indian soldiers that decamped to England. If you could speak briefly about the challenges they faced, the purposes they were deployed to, and the novelty and homesickness of life in England for them.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think the challenges must have been quite a lot. But I think they got used to them. Maybe also having been in France. So, for example, one of the lovely things that happened to them was they went to Woking Mosque. Shortly after they'd arrived in Britain, a couple of weeks after Dunkirk, they were taken to the mosque in Woking, the Shah Jahan Mosque, which is the oldest purpose-built mosque in Britain, built in 1889. So that, I think, must have helped them with the homesickness. That, plus the fact that they were in these sort of, to some extent, closed communities. The company was together, they were supporting each other. Their officers, and some of their officers were British and some of their officers were Indian. Their officers were always really focused on their morale, focused on things like letters home, food, making sure that the food that they were eating was familiar and was enough. So chapatis and sheep and curry and spices, making sure that their religious needs were catered for. So there was a Maulvi in every company. They could fast at Ramadan. They could go to mosques. They could pray 5 times a day. There was always some kind of facility for that. So I think, it's hard to know it's really hard to know, but I think some of them found that actually, although they were homesick, and some of them were away from home for, 6 years in some cases, nearly 6 years, mostly less than that. But yes, they were homesick, but I think they found that it was probably more comfortable than it might have been if they had been, for example, in Burma or in North Africa. Comfortable in some ways, less comfortable in other ways. I mean, the temperature, the cold, the rain, I think people, that must have been quite a strain. In terms of purposes, though, that the other part of your question, first of all, it was unclear after Dunkirk. It was unclear what they would be doing because they had to leave all of their mules and all of their equipment apart. They came out of France with nothing except the clothes they were standing in. They had to leave everything in France. So there was a process of finding new mules and pack horses for them. And then there was a time when they were thinking about training them as drivers of trucks. And then they were also trained in the use of rifles because they hadn't been equipped with any weapons when they were in France. And then the plan emerged by the spring of 1941. The plan emerged that they would be working with British infantry brigades to prepare for an invasion of Norway, which is a cold, snowy, mountainous country, and a country where animal transport would be absolutely essential. So in fact, 3 more companies came out from India to join them, and then they spent the rest of their time in Britain working, training in the mountains with these British infantry guys. And then a few sort of special projects as well, like, for example, working on a fort in the middle of the sea between England and Wales, where it was impossible because it was so steep, it was impossible to get things up the hill by any means other than mules. So they had a few kind of really specialist postings like that.
I'd like to come to the prisoners of war. And you really very beautifully resurrect the difficult choices faced by the prisoners, whether to stay loyal to the British or to fight for the Indian Legion, which seems an almost totally forgotten aspect of our history. I mean, there's still some talk about the INA in Southeast Asia, but we've completely forgotten about the Indian Legion. So would you like to speak a little bit about the choices they faced, the prisoners of war?
Sure, yeah. So I think, and some of them were in prison of war camps for 5 years. They were taken prisoner in the summer of 1940, of June in 1940, and that some of them weren't released until May 45. And I think that makes them the longest Indian prisoners of war ever in history. Their choices were difficult. So, for the first year, they were the only Indian prisoners in German hands. So that must have been strange. And then one of the things that happened was that the officers and the other ranks were separated. And that's kind of was standard practice for the Germans at the time. So there were separate camps for the officers, including the Indian Viceroy's commissioned officers, the Jemidars, the Subadars, Risaldars. And then they settled down into life in the prisoner of war camps. And most of them being not officers, most of them were required to work. So they were taken out and put into local factories or working in the land in France or in Germany, wherever their camp was. And some of them were in camps in Italy as well. And then along comes Subhas Chandra Bose. After there were more Indian prisoners of war who'd been taken in North Africa or even in Greece. Then Subhas Chandra Bose, who'd been in prison, home arrest in Kolkata, he escaped. He went to Kabul. He went to Russia. He went eventually to Berlin. And there he negotiated with the German Foreign Ministry, and he set up this idea of the Free Indian Legion. which became the 950th Regiment of the German Army. And so he went round, and there were other Indians in Berlin at the time. There was what was it called? I can't remember the German name for it, but the Indian Center in Berlin, which was also broadcasting radio show programs. And so they went to the prisoner of war camps and they talked to the prisoners of war. And Bose was clearly extremely charismatic and a great talker. He had, he was able to communicate with ordinary soldiers as well as with officers. So he went to the prisoner of war. Him and his comrades went to the prisoners of war camps, and they talked to the Indian prisoners of war, and they started to win them over, and they started to persuade them to join this Free Indian Legion and to leave behind the British Army. And about 30 of them did, so it's around 10%. And altogether, there were hundreds and hundreds of Indian prisoners of war in Europe who did join the Legion, which was was never the same size as the INA in Burma, which was 44,000. But nevertheless, it was still an interesting. And it wasn't militarily significant. Hitler himself was quite rude about them. Actually, he said that they were. I think he said that they were a joke. So they joined the German army. They were given German uniforms. They were given training. They all had to start again at the lowest rank. Their officers were German, although later on some of the Indians were promoted. And there's lots of interesting photographs. You can find them on the internet of them in German uniforms. And they were training in Germany. Then they were posted in the Netherlands, and then in France, in the southwest of France. And that's where they were when the Allies invaded France in the summer of 1944. And they very quickly withdrew across France. They had some fights with Free French soldiers, and they were drawn back into Germany. And at the end of the war, they became, again, prisoners of the British this time. So that was a small amount of, a small percentage, about 10% of those who were taken prisoner. And then at the other end of the spectrum, there were about 10 of them who escaped. And I wish I knew more about their escapes. There are these very fragmentary documents in the National Archives in London, and a few things that I found while I was in India as well, with these stories, very brief stories about guys who escaped from Italy, or from France, or even from Germany. And they escaped to neutral countries, to Spain or to Switzerland, and they were successful. They slipped away from the Germans at one point or another. Fascinating stories, and I'm hoping to find out some more about them. And then the majority of the prisoners of war, they just waited. They did what prisoners of war do. They sat behind the barbed wire. They were working, of course. Like I said, most of them were not officers, so they were working, going out every day. And they received parcels from the Red Cross. There was an organisation in Britain called the Indian Comforts Fund, which was sending parcels to them on a regular basis. So they were getting extra food and cigarettes and chocolate that was coming to them. And by the end of the war, they were actually in a better situation than a lot of the civilians in the towns and the villages around them. And they kind of waited for the war to end. They waited for the liberation process, and which must have been incredibly boring and quite difficult. There's a lot of stories about British prisoners of war in camps, and how they had, they did a lot of studying, for example. They learned languages, or they learned about philosophy. They gave classes for each other. And there's a lot of drama performances, songs and music and so on. And I haven't found out much that's about Indian prisoners of war. I would love to. If any of your listeners know anything at all about Indian prisoners of war in Europe in the Second World War, I would really like to hear from them. Please get in touch. I'd love to know, were they, dancing Bhangra in these, were they able to improvise some musical instruments and to dance there in these prisoner of war camps? Or were they putting on plays? Or were they, drawing pictures of each other? I'm sure they must have been, because there's a lot of time on your hands. You've got to fill that time, even though they were working, nevertheless. So yeah, a tough war in many ways, sitting in those prisoner of war camps.
Since the subtitle of your book is The Forgotten Muslim Soldiers, the Battle of Dunkirk, I suppose we have to speak about the Christopher Nolan film that you do several times in the book. And when I saw the film, I thought it was a fantastic film, but obviously there's some very significant omissions there, including the Indian soldiers who were omitted from that narrative. And something which I felt is in tune with broader mainstream narratives in Britain, especially around the way Brexit emerged as sort of British exceptionalism, and Dunkirk came a year after Brexit. So, what do you think accounts for this sort of exclusivism? Why have these soldiers been excised, though they were very salient at the time? You talk about the press coverage that they received when they were in Britain, but now they've been totally forgotten and sort of erased from history. Why? What do you think the reason?
Yeah, that's a great question, Vaibhav. Great question. Part of it, I think Christopher Nolan, looking at that film to begin with, he didn't really know anything about them. When he started that film, when they were making that film, I was doing my research, and I heard that the film was coming, and I thought, oh wow, I wonder if they picked up the story. And of course they didn't, because his focus was very narrow. His focus was on British Army, British Navy, partly the Navy, but also the small ships, and the Royal Air Force. That was what he was looking at. So, you can say that the fact that he didn't pick up on the presence of the few hundred Indians is an omission. But actually, it's a far bigger omission that he doesn't really do much in that movie about the French army. 120,000, a third of the soldiers that were evacuated from those beaches were French. That, I think, is a bigger omission on his part. And certainly there are French journalists who have been quite angry about that, and French historians. So it was a good film. I agree with you. It was a well-made film, and it was it was a great success. And of course, if it hadn't been a great success, then we wouldn't be talking about it in this way, because it wouldn't have mattered so much. And interestingly, there was a BBC TV program the year after called World on Fire. I think it was something like that, World on Fire, which also went to Dunkirk and did put an Indian soldier there, but he was an Indian soldier with a British accent, and he had the wrong kind of uniform, and he was on his own rather than in a company, and he was getting out of the back of a truck. So that kind of also felt like they'd missed the point, really. So I guess that's another thing I want to say to your listeners. If anyone out there wants to make a film about Dunkirk and the Indian soldiers there, it's going to be a great film. Please do, please make it happen. So, but your bigger question is why they have been forgotten or excised, and how that relates to Brexit, really. And I think that's a really difficult question to answer. I think it's partly because in British. And of course, that's the answer to that question is very different from where I'm sitting to where you're sitting. Why have they been forgotten in India, in Pakistan? I kind of feel like I want to give that question back to you and to your listeners and say, you tell me why they've been forgotten. But certainly here in Britain, and more broadly in Europe, in Britain, there's quite a narrow discourse, a narrow version of the Second World War that focuses on some things. So at school, for example, and I've been doing quite a lot of work in schools over the last couple of years, telling this story and trying to broaden the perspective. But in schools, they learn about the home front. They learn about what happened in Britain. So the bombing by the Germans, evacuation of children, gas masks, rationing of food, those kind of things. And then they learn some of the key kind of battles. So particularly D-Day seems to always be a big one. The Battle of Britain, to some extent Dunkirk as well. But then they leave out, they forget about North Africa. They completely forget about Burma. Most British people will not really know about the breadth. They won't have that understanding that it's known as the World War because it affected almost every country in the world. Even if they weren't a competent country, they were involved in supplying stuff for the armies and for the competent countries. So it's the forgetting is partly about that. It's partly part of a general forgetting of the broader Commonwealth Empire international contributions. I mean, most British people don't even know that China was involved in the war, and China lost, probably 10 million people. So it's about a kind of a general ignorance and a general narrow focus. That's what I think it's about.
Do you think, because for me what's very striking is repeatedly you bring out the press coverage that the Indian contingents are receiving in Britain, and which makes me wonder whether at the time, British still being a world power, still being very important in the world, there's a greater confidence about, and you're in the middle of war, you're in the middle of propaganda, there's a greater confidence about putting this out. And as Britain's role in the world has shrunk, this exceptionalism has almost been invented as a reaction to Britain's diminishing place in the world.
That's a really interesting perspective, Ivo. I haven't heard that before. And I also like your saying that Britain was still a world power. So the implication is that Britain is no longer a world power. And I think I think we can say, I would agree with you that India is probably a greater world power than Britain is now. And certainly Britain is less of a world power than it was in the 1940s, definitely. And there was a confidence then about how Britain saw itself and the empire. Yeah, I think so, definitely. I think there was, the Second World War really marked the end of the empire. Although it didn't actually happen then, everything, people say that the fall of Singapore in the beginning of 1942, that's what kind of led to Indian independence. That what led, and that kind of, and a lot of it, the other Asian colonies, they saw that Britain was fallible and could lose this military conflict, and therefore, that they had the confidence to claim their independence more strongly. So, I think there is some truth in that. And yes, you're right. I mean, the amount of press coverage that these guys got was enormous. I mean, they were in the local papers, they were in the national papers, they were in, there's a lot of film footage of them, and they had quite a high profile at the time. Yeah, definitely.
I'd like to get to some of the afterlife of this. At one point, you speak about the Indian contingent as a precursor to the post-war migration that followed. And I'd just like to quote you a little bit, where you say there's an interesting reversal here, the Indian presence in Britain reflecting the British presence in India. One created the other, and the political slogan used by descendants of migrants to the UK, "We are here because you were there," has its roots in this time, before the flow of migration shifted from Britain outwards to Britain inwards. Could you speak a little bit about how that was related to the later debates around immigration and multiculturalism in British life?
Yeah, thank you. It's really complicated as well. There was in Britain at the beginning of the war, there were around 10,000 Indians. Seems to be there's no precise figures, but that seems to be the best guess. And there were doctors, there were students, there were Lascars, sailors, there were peddlers, traveling around the villages selling things. There were a large number of Indians here already. But yes, there had been this massive flow of migration from Britain to South Asia for hundreds of years, military, civilian, business, massive amount of business, education, all kinds of people coming from here to going from me to you, as it were. And that was such a common experience for British families. And then, the Second World War, and very shortly after the Second World War, of course, independence and partition, and then that kind of flow changes. Although it was more in the 50s that the large numbers happened. And that central idea, "we are here because you were there," is an idea that hasn't really been grasped by a lot of people in Britain. I think they haven't understood that the reason for migration from South Asia, but also from the Caribbean, from some parts of Africa. The reason for that migration is because those countries were part of the British Empire, whether they liked it or not, and therefore there is a connection. There is a language connection as well. And for a long time, there was, until I think 1971, citizens of Commonwealth countries could become British citizens easily. And so that meant that it was a natural flow. It was a natural flow from India, from Pakistan, from Bangladesh to Britain. And I think, British people haven't really grasped that. Lots of British people haven't grasped that. Some have, but the sense, because they're not in touch with, British people aren't in touch with empire and its legacy. There's a book by a guy called Satnam Sanghera, who's a British guy with Indian Sikh heritage, who wrote a book called Empire Land, and there's now a TV series that is just the 2-part TV series that's running at the moment about this whole question of why Britain and British people haven't really faced up to the empire, and how important the empire is in everything that happens here, including Brexit. So the Brexit legacy, the Brexit idea is partly about the rejection of immigration and immigrants and the children and the grandchildren of immigrants. So it's, to some extent, people voted for Brexit. I mean, I didn't. I voted to stay in the European Union. I think it was a terrible decision. But some of the people who voted for Brexit were just basically saying, I don't want people who look different, who have different surnames, different skin colours, different religions. I don't want them coming over here, or I don't even want them even if they were born here and their parents were born here. There's a basic xenophobia, racism in that. And I think if those people understood what the empire was, how the empire was created, what it led to, the relationship between Britain and all of those many, many countries. I mean, a quarter of the world's population in 1939 were part of the British Empire. If British people understood that better, then I think we as a country would be in a much better state in terms of our race relations. Having said that, I do think that things are getting better over here. And I think that when I look at the European neighbours, I think that we're actually doing better than some of them in terms of peaceful coexistence and acceptance of one by the other. And that's a big part of what I aim to do with the book, and also aim to do in other work that I'm doing, is to enable people to get along with each other and to understand each other from different backgrounds.
If someone were to ask you, and this sort of a follow-up from what you were saying, the fact that some of these Indian guys went to World War II in Europe, I mean, why should we care? What are the implications and importance for today? And you have, for someone who has, I know the answer because you sort of lay down the importance of it towards the end of the book, but for the readers for the people who haven't read the book yet, if you could tell them, if you would just speak a little bit about why should we care?
Why should we care? That's a great question. Well, firstly, the reason I cared about it was because I thought it was a great story. I just found that it really, the more I uncovered, the more I found other great stories that were kind of running off it or part of it. So, and I love stories. So that, I think, is one reason why we should care. But also, I think I kind of put this back to you. The book is published in Britain, and now it's been published in India. It's the same book, it's the same text, apart from one spelling error. And I wonder whether the people of India and Pakistan, Bangladesh, I think for them it's different. I think the reason that they should care is because to a large extent, the Second World War has been forgotten in South Asia, and that's because everything, as I understand it, everything revolves around 1947. The important event of the 20th century was partition and independence, and the Second World War was part of the process that led to that. And so there's been a very large forgetting of the whole, of the sides of the war. Although interestingly, the INA and Netaji Bose are, much better remembered, from what I've seen, than those who fought on the side of the British, even though that was a much larger number. So when I was in India, I went into an Indian bookshop in Jaipur, and I looked for the books about the Second World War. I looked for the shelves of books about the Second World War, and I didn't find them. I found one book, The Father's Field by Raghu Karnad, which is a really interesting book. He's a great writer. It's a really interesting story that brings together the story of three men from his family and the broader overall picture of the war. And there are how many millions? There were 2.5 million men in the Indian Army. There were in the war. There were 11,500 women, and there were countless others who were involved in other things to do with the war. Everyone in India was to some extent affected by the war. So everybody, perhaps your grandparents were affected by the war, and the people who are listening, their grandparents or their great-grandparents, or maybe even themselves, or their parents, they were affected by the war. So I kind of think there are personal stories there, personal family stories there that deserve telling and listening to and sharing in the way that Raghu Karnad does, and in the way that I've been able to do in a few cases because I was lucky enough to find relatives who could talk about it. So that's one of the reasons why we should care. Over here, I think one of the reasons that we should care is because of the racism that exists within British society, and the fact that this small story really, which reflects the bigger story of the greater Indian involvement, is a direct challenge to what British racists would assert, which is all about kind of exceptionalism and standing alone and being outside of anything else, being, separate from the rest of the world and winning the war single-handedly, which of course is nonsense. So that, I think, is the reason why we should care. But again, I'm tempted to turn the question back to you, Vaibhav, and say, why do you think that people in India should care?
Well, I'm, of course, not an expert in this field, but just before your book, I also read Jasmine Khan's The Rajat War, which I'd bought a couple of years ago, but hadn't been able to get around to. And of course, she had the foreword to your book as well. And I think that, for me, again, brought out another, because as you said, like, we are so dominated by 1947. It is the fracture that we're still sort of contending with. So I think the Second World War story has sort of faded in with what came after. I think, to me, that is the main reason why, because 47 was such a cataclysm. It changed cities, like the city Delhi where I live. It changed so many things that I think the Second World War seems just very, very small compared to what came after. It's just, as someone, as a complete non-expert would say. I'd like to end on a couple of questions, which on a slightly personal note. I understand you're a Quaker by personal faith. So how does that shape your writing about war?
Oh, that's a great question. Thank you for that. Well, yes, I am a Quaker. And as you may know, a lot of Quakers are pacifists. And I am a pacifist. And one of the reasons that I'm a pacifist is, on a personal note, is because I had two grandfathers. One grandfather was called John Bowman, and he was in the army in the First World War. Both of my grandfathers were in the First World War. So John Bowman was in the trenches in the British Army with a British rifle and a British uniform fighting against the Germans. And my other grandfather was Heinrich Kolden, and he was in the German Army with a German uniform and a German rifle fighting against the British. And of course, they didn't know each other. And they both died long before I was born. But they both thought that they were doing the right thing. They were both fighting for their king or their Kaiser. They were fighting for their country. They were, doing what was right, what they thought was right, and what their family and what they were told to do. And yet they can't both be right. They can't both have been on the right side. War, I think, is appalling, is devastating, is incredibly destructive, is something that humanity needs to move beyond. War is an old-fashioned thing And I think that we humans need to find ways to not only stop war, but stop the preparation for war, and live together more peacefully. And part of that comes about through understanding each other, through understanding people who may look very different and worship very differently, but who essentially are still human beings underneath. And I think the stories that I found, the stories of camaraderie and of friendship and of coming together and of love as well, I think those stories help to counteract the tendency to divide. Those stories are stories about people coming together. So that, and yet, as I say, I'm a Quaker and a pacifist, but I'm also very interested in the war because it affected my family. The First World War, also the Second World War, affected my family very much. I was born myself 16 years after the war finished, but it was very much part of my upbringing in terms of the media that were around me and what kids were talking about in the 1960s and 70s. So I think it was a pivotal event in history, and it remains a pivotal event in history. And I think we need to learn from it in the way that, things like the United Nations were created after the Second World War. We need to learn from it the lessons of peace. And we need to do our best to stop warfare in any way.
That's a wonderful note to end on. My last question would be, what next? What can we expect to be next? Are you working on something?
Yes, absolutely. My next book is looking at prisoners of war, Indian prisoners of war in Europe. So I'm hoping to finally get and be able to do some research in the next few months, and to find out about Indian prisoners of war who were taken by the Italians and the Germans and who ended up in camps around Europe, and who some cases escaped and in some cases joined the German army, and in some cases sat there and just existed. And I'm looking to find some of those stories, particularly one story. Yeah, so that's my next. So I repeat my challenge to your listeners. If anyone knows anything about Indian prisoners of war in the Second World War in Europe, then please get in touch.
That would be amazing, and really look forward to that. Thank you so much for your time, Ghee.
That's my great pleasure. Nice talking to you, Vaibhav. Thank you so much.
Thank you for staying on for the full conversation. If you like what we do, please share it with your friends and family. You can also leave us a review or rating on iTunes and Apple Podcasts. The crew that makes these podcasts possible is Gaurav Krishna on sound supervision and production, with support from S. Saranaraj and Raghavendra Tenkaila. Artwork and design is by Chandni Venkataraman of Crisscross Design Studio. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. It can also be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcentre.org. Do follow us on Instagram for updates on all our programming. This is Lekha Naidu signing off on behalf of everyone at BIC.